Boom, we're recording. Amazing.
All right, welcome everybody. I think we're going to give people a few seconds to join. Sorry, we're getting started a few minutes late. Just had to get some Zoom issues set up, but all right. Okay, I think we can get started. We've got a pretty good contingent here.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar based on Nick Drain's essay and web experience, What Are You Looking At?, about exploring the intersections of photographic violence, Blackness, surveillance, and invisibility. Hi, I'm Shanoa Baker, an arts writer and curator working with Bunker Projects. On this panel, we have Nick Drain in conversation with Harrison Kinnane Smith, a board member at Bunker Projects. Bunker Projects is an artist residency and experimental gallery specializing in contemporary and multidisciplinary art making. Tonight's programming is part of our Online Reviews new handoff series, which is designed to provide emerging Black artists with the opportunity to think and write critically about key topics around their creative practice. We are excited to bring artist Nick Drain, the handoff's most recent essay contributor, and review editor Harrison Kinnane Smith together in conversation for Bunker Project's first live webinar. First, a bit more on tonight's speakers. Nick Drain is a fine artist born in Chicago, Illinois, who lives and works in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, centering his thinking around Blackness. His work investigates the politics of visibility in an effort to illustrate the complex relationships of Blackness and Black people to the object of the camera. Through image, sculpture, and writing, Nick rotates the triangular viewer-subject-maker relationship present in all instances of figural representation to place the Black subject at the top, thus reconfiguring the surveilling power dynamic between those who are privileged to observe the way the white gaze and those who are rendered hyper-visible by their Blackness. He has exhibited locally, nationally, and most notably showing at the International Center for Photography in New York City and the Colorado Photographic Art Center in Denver. Nick attended Yale Norfolk School of Art in 2019 and received a BFA from the New Studio Practice program at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design in 2020. Harrison Kinnane Smith is an artist based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His interdisciplinary work aims to highlight and interrogate the anthropogenic ecological change and racialized systems of power. During the summer of 2019, Harrison attended the Yale Norfolk School of Art, where he and Nick first met. In 2020, he graduated from Yale University with a degree in art and ecology and evolutionary biology, and was named an award recipient in the Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh program, a partnership of the Pittsburgh Foundation and the Heinz Endowments. Since the fall of 2020, Harrison has been a board member of Bunker Projects, where he directs the Handoff series. We are excited to get this started, and without further ado, here are the two panelists to talk about this work.
Thanks so much, Noah, for that great welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Or this afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. So just before we get started, I wanted to go through a couple, or just some of the Zoom logistics, since this is a webinar. I think for all of the participants, you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on that at any time. And we ask that if you have questions, you can enter them there rather than in the chat function. And we'll see that and answer them as they come up, or rather when it's relevant, I guess, to the discussion. We're going to have about a 45-minute discussion, Nick and I are, and then there's going to be about 20 minutes for a Q&A at the end. And before we start, I also wanted to talk a little bit more about the handoff series. So as we mentioned, Nick is our first guest contributor to the series, which we've just began this fall. As Shanoa said, it's focused on providing a platform for young Black artists, emerging Black artists to write critically rather than produce necessarily artwork, and write about the things related to their practice. So we're really excited to inaugurate Bunker's actual live webinar presence with this talk around the handoff. And I just wanted to do a quick plug that an exciting part of the series is that each contributor selects their successor. So Nick has selected interdisciplinary artist Tina Wilder for to write the next essay. So keep your eyes out for that. That's going to be coming out in the next month or so. All right, so I just wanted to also last beginning thing, for those of you who haven't read the essay, I'm just going to do a quick summary of it, and then we'll get started. So the essay as I see it, and I worked actually a lot with Nick editing this for the abridged version that we published through Bunker. And I pulled out the sentence that I kind of view as the thesis of the work, which is, quote, "The technology that is race and the technology that is photography have become intertwined in their applications, the latter being imbued with the white gaze and used to further cement the former." And from there, Nick goes on to walk us through the history of photography, drawing connections between technological advancements in image making and the advancement of different systems of racial violence. And Nick concludes with a discussion of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon and Simone Brown's dark sousveillance, a term that describes, quote, methods used to render oneself out of sight. And Nick begins discussing ways that dark surveillance might be practiced by victims of racial violence, specifically Black people, in light of the relationship between photography and racial violence, and hints at that maybe happening in his work. So with that summary, I wanted to start off, Nick, by asking you a little bit about your practice. So how your creative work, making images and making sculptural works and social practice work, led you to this kind of thinking and eventually this essay. And then maybe if you get a chance to talk a little bit more about how, after writing this essay, your work has changed.
Yeah, totally. And I know kind of in this, I like prepared a couple images so that, you know, we can accompany the things that I'm saying with visuals. So if there's a moment you want me to hop to those, let me know, but I'll kind of answer that question off the top. But I mean, how it is that I came to the thinking that kind of makes up WAILA, which you might, all of like you attending, you may hear either myself or Harrison refer to, like say WAILA, which is just the abbreviation or sorry, the acronym of what are you looking at, and it's kind of become like a quick colloquial way to refer to it. So when I say that, that's what I mean. But how is it that I kind of like made my way to the thinking and like all of the research that's in WAILA? It's a question where it's like, you know, where does the trajectory really start? You could consider like the first image that I kind of ever really made like potentially being relevant, but I think where it all really started for me was at Norfolk, actually, where we met. And I think it was like being in this new space, being removed from like the space that I was comfortable with making images in, and kind of encountering all of these ways where it felt like the photographic medium was failing for me. Thinking about kind of the failure of the medium, and then all of these things that like the photographic medium can't do. So really kind of like making work that was thinking about all of the kind of limitations of the photographic medium and kind of utilizing that more as like a pertinent subject matter, rather approaching it from not necessarily like what can this medium do, but what can't it do, and then can I make work from that space. That kind of really brought me into thinking about like all of the things that we maybe expect photography to do, or that I'd kind of come to understand or expect photography to do, that it actually doesn't. And then that kind of like opened up all these doors for thinking about it from my perspective, being Black, like how is it that the medium kind of relates to me in the moment that I exist in now. So that like it all kind of happened really naturally, and it felt like the research kind of really led me.
Thank you for that. And would you mind actually going through some of those images? I know that at Norfolk you made some images that are really relevant to this work, but also, yeah, I mean, maybe show also some of the work before that, and then also, like I said, after, just so we can kind of get an image of the trajectory your work has taken as you've come to and then further explored these ideas.
Yeah, so I'm gonna hop on. I'll share my screen now. Are you seeing that? I know I like have sometimes sharing issues between. Yeah, you're seeing that though?
Yep.
Okay, amazing. So I guess I'll give like a quick little artist talk run through before we get to Wayla. But this image is like usually the place around in the timeline of my work that I kind of start like any talk that I give. There may be one image before it, but I've kind of cut that for the sake of brevity. But this image for me was like kind of the synthesis of pretty much like every image I've been making before when kind of self-portraiture started to become the focus of my work. So this image is called One for Us, and it was made in 2019. And it was an image kind of thinking about how is it that I could contain. I was like asking a question, and this is like a way that thinking about failure kind of has always like felt relevant to my work. But I was asking a question about like, is it possible for me to contain the whole of Black masculinity in one image? And so kind of like asking that question, knowing that it wouldn't necessarily be possible, but like what would it mean to try? And kind of what would be discovered in the aspect of trying. And so I kind of like made this image. I was like studying Renaissance painting at the time, so kind of like calling upon a lot of different like cultural symbols and artifacts to kind of talk about different facets of Black masculinity and kind of like making this vignette. But this was really the moment where it felt like a lot of things I'd been doing in my work in terms of how I was utilizing the gaze, in terms of how I was utilizing my own body, in terms of how I was like addressing the camera, all became they kind of all came together in one image. Like I'd never brought it all together until this image was made. And so I think like this was the moment that it all kind of clicked. And this was also the first image where I kind of began to address the camera directly and like explicitly in the image I was making. So like this being in a photographic studio, but extending the frame beyond the backdrop as like a simple gesture, but then also being able to see the camera that's making the image in the photograph, but also being told that I'm the individual making it. So kind of like there's a weird, I like when I sit with the image, there's kind of this strange, like you're looking in and then you're seeing the position that you're looking from, but you're also in the position, but then you're also seeing who's making. So kind of like that aspect, I think even as I say that, maybe that being the beginning of this thinking about the triangulation between a subject, a maker, and then a viewer when you're kind of viewing any figural representation.
Yeah, and quickly while we're still on this, I know that this is maybe jumping ahead of ourselves, but I can't help but bring up the there's a point in the essay where you quote Arthur Jafa, and I don't have actually maybe I do somewhere in these notes, but he says something to the effect of that whiteness is so embedded within the camera that even when there's a Black person standing behind the camera taking a photo of a Black person, there's still that camera still is functioning as the white gaze. And something I was planning on asking you, and we can, like I said, of course, return to this later, but I'm really interested in the way that you've kind of addressed this question or addressed that relationship of like the photograph containing all of those layers of whiteness embedded within it just through its production. And how you've kind of taken that apart in what you were just saying, and in revealing the camera and the actor, the photographer in the work, and continuing that in the work feels like you were maybe starting to pick that apart before you even, had heard that quote perhaps, or definitely before you'd written the essay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty confident it would have been before I heard that quote. I think when I like really started studying like Jatha heavily was around the summer of Norfolk. And this was made, it was probably pretty close. So there's a chance I'd seen that quote beforehand. But yeah, that's like a question that is definitely going to become more relevant as we talk forward. But what I can say is like, I think with that quote, something that I don't want to kind of be, to go under the rug when we bring up that quote is like, also, I think there's a really important implication of like context as well. So the reason kind of the camera carries this potentially inescapable like propagation of the white gaze is not just because it's like because of photographic history, it's because of like photographic technology and like implicit biases that are built into that, but then also the fact of like um, the white gaze kind of being imbued simply into the way we see. So like even in the moments that maybe, and this is like a thought that I kind of synthesized like after writing the essay, but I started thinking about like the fact that the white gaze probably even permeates like simply the way we see the world, kind of being the prevailing like gaze. So there's a lot of context wrapped up in that question, and I think it's important to me when I like approach that quote. It's understanding that it's not just like the camera itself, and it's to say like, okay, if we take this tool and we kind of like, I don't know, we step one layer outside, like 1 degree outside of it, all of a sudden we're out of that space because the camera is kind of it's like a point in a network, you know what I mean? And I think I'm trying to kind of like widen the scope of what we're looking at in the network. But I'll move on to the next work. So after this, kind of thinking about how it is that like the subject operates in the image and kind of the moments where the gaze is activated and the subject can address the viewer. I was also making work around the same time that looked a little bit like this. And I think this wasn't my first foray into sculpture, but I think the moment it kind of like established itself as like a genuine part of my practice. But I started making these, this is called Black, American flag #3. This is the third. And I think I made maybe somewhere between like 5 and 8 of these, but there's only 3 that generally are shown. And I'll only talk about 2 here. But I started making these works that were these kind of like sculptural objects that featured text, in most cases that had come from me, but also sometimes appropriated text. And I was thinking about how it was that I was like, this work came out of a moment where I was in like a classroom setting, and like an individual said something that was really kind of like insensitive, and all of a sudden I was like put in this place of like I was hyper visible in the room, and kind of a lot of responsibility for what the other student had said fell on me. And so I felt so, it was like a really really kind of like potent moment for me, feeling that way and kind of feeling the way that my body was like all of a sudden kind of like on display. And so I think that kind of pushed me in this direction of thinking about how it was that I could represent myself and my body and my experience without having to actually like subject the representation of my body itself to like a kind of violence by visibility. And that's something we'll talk about later as well. But so I started thinking about, well, like, what is it potentially that can kind of do the role of representing a person or a people without necessarily needing to show them. And I arrived at like flag, which was also pertinent, kind of being a Black person in America, not really like identifying with the American flag. I kind of started making these works thinking about like, well, what does it mean for me as an individual to kind of like say, I don't feel space made for me in this flag, so I'm going to instead kind of like set out and make my own, and also hold my own flag maybe in the same regard as the other flag. But then also, what does it mean to like also make multiples of that, and kind of like representing different parts of the experience, or like my experience in my body through these things, and also like allowing them to connect with others' experiences in the moments that they naturally did. But I started making this work, which in a studio visit that I had, someone kind of pointed out to me really kind of intelligently, I would say, that like the work in space, kind of standing next to it even feels like a body, and kind of felt like a body leaning or like a kneeling. And I think that comment for me, like I didn't realize it in the moment, but it also opened up a space for me to like, I think that was the moment where I kind of got green lighted into like, okay, I can make sculptures that are kind of just as relevant, like as a manifestation of my body, as I was making self-portraits. And so I think that kind of freed up my thinking in relation to that. And this is another one. So you can't read it, the text on this reads, "It's always taking mode." And then this is Black American flag number 2. And this one is the text reads, "I don't want to have to be smart all the time. I don't want to have to outsmart you all the time. I don't want you to be so fucking stupid." So also text that kind of came out of some like ruminating I was doing in that same moment, coming out of that interaction with that classmate. And then from there, so all of that work was made, or at least like kind of finished and finalized, but primarily made during the later half of my junior year. So kind of right before we like met up at Norfolk for the first time. And then so that's when we kind of get to these works, which I don't show like much of the work I made at Norfolk, but these images have like kind of survived the experience. And these are respectively from left to right, portrait of HS, portrait of ND, and portrait of TW. And these are kind of like a really nice, these portraits are kind of like a really nice meeting point between, I would say, the work I was making before and then kind of the work that I'm making now, which is that they're like an approach to portraiture, but one that's really kind of a bit tongue in cheek, I think, when I think about them, because they're portraits of individuals, but they're distinctly portraits of like those individuals' hair, and specifically like in the place that it was cut. But they're images of hair, which are this like, so in hair, there is DNA, and DNA is a certain type of data that like, if you access it properly, you can learn such an immense amount about the person who it belongs to. So for instance, you could take some of this hair and analyze it through certain means and receive all of this information about like what an individual might look like, what kind of might be in their familial history, all of these kind of things. Like you can learn an immense amount about that person. So there is like all of this data present in these scenes and in these moments that say so much about the individual that they are kind of picturing, quote unquote.
And their ancestry, right?
And their ancestry, like there's so much information present here. But I'm utilizing a tool, which is the camera, to kind of present this information, but the camera is totally incapable of like accessing that info. So it kind of does this thing where like there is all of this information is present, but it can't be read. And even more information that would be given about a person than like a traditional understanding of a portrait taken with a camera might generally present. And so I think that was a moment for me where like the making kind of got really fun. When I think about like these images, I kind of always laugh at them. But that's where it kind of like the thinking I think really started to open and like started to germinate about how I would move into the space that I'm in now, and how I would navigate my relationship to the photographic medium in moving in that way. And also these works did something that I'd always been kind of trying to do in my work, in that kind of instantiation of like the triangle being this kind of representation, which I wish I had included that graphic in my presentation here, but it's in the essay. If anybody's like in attendance, if you just hop on Bunker Project's website, it's a triangle. It's kind of like it's a triangle. On each point, there is the maker, the subject, and the camera. Oh my God, haven't revisited that in a while. But in that triangle, I'm always trying to like think about how it is that power can be given to the subject, and specifically the Black subject. And so all of this hair like belonging to different Black people, it kind of, for me, did this thing where you have like an individual is able to be represented in a portrait, but also maintain like total anonymity. So it's like offer this opportunity to photograph another Black person, but not ask them to necessarily turn over their likeness or turn over their representation, to kind of like be proliferated in spaces that they won't necessarily be present or like consent to.
Yeah,
so
and that feels this feels like a perfect example of the kind of dark sousveillance you talk about in the essay as well, the mediation of one's visibility selectively to avoid the kind of co-option by the racial systems, oppressive or exploitative racial systems.
Yeah, and that was definitely kind of the beginning of the thinking, like the beginning of the trying to bring that into my work. And that even like extends to how the pieces are titled, like not giving over the names of the individuals that are being photographed. So really kind of building in all of these like steps of mediation between the person being photographed and the person looking at the photograph. Whereas thinking about how is it that access can be mediated. And that's like something that I was thinking about in even the self-portraits I was making through like 2018 and 2019. But I think I was like actually getting better at working through here. And then that kind of perfectly segues into this image, thinking about kind of the reservedness and like the mediation of one's own representation. This image is called Implicit Bias Test number 2. And this was also made during my time at Norfolk. And this is an image that's kind of like a really kind of straightforward, I guess, exploration of thinking about, okay, how is it that I can talk about all of these biases and all of these like failures that I'm coming to understand in the photographic medium in this language of photography that I already understand. So I think this was kind of the moment, or another moment, where I think a lot of my work is like reflexive, in that it's self-referential in at least one way or another. But this was kind of like, okay, really kind of trying to fold this moment with the medium in on itself, where I'm photographing like an individual who, I mean, you know this, Harrison, but kind of conveniently, like really serendipitously, actually like wouldn't consent to being photographed, but I didn't know that before I asked them and like had kind of concepted this shot. So it just worked out really nicely. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a really simple, at least looking back on it, like a simple exploration of the implicit biases specifically built into like the methods and the technologies of exposure, like tangible kind of camera exposure that were built into photographic history. So I would imagine if you're here, you're somewhat involved in like photography, but if not, what's being held in this image is like an external light meter. And I won't go like too heady into how it can be used in the like deep depths of the photograph. But essentially, like there's 2 ways to meter with an external light meter, and both of those ways have to do how you're taught to meter with an external light meter actually has like significant ramifications on your ability to photograph people with darker skin, is I guess the shortest way I can say that. And so thinking about that, but then also thinking about the ways, and this is something that's also kind of explored in Wayla, so I know we'll talk about it later, but thinking about the ways that bias was like distinctly built into the photographic medium in the method of exposure, and kind of thinking about for the first time how that could be like a power for the subject. So this subject distinctly like not wanting to be photographed, kind of interjecting like a light meter in between the camera and that individual. It is like literally photographic technology, which is keeping you from accessing this person's representation properly, which was kind of just a comment on like the fact that that happens in every image to some degree, or at least like has happened in the history of images. Whereas like the technology of exposure, or how we kind of handle the technology of exposure, has kept us from properly rendering and therefore like connecting with certain people. But then also this image, I think about, so like there's my perspective in making the image where I'm behind the camera, which is kind of the perspective you're looking from. But I also think about this perspective, like this image, in the perspective of the individual who's on the other side, and them kind of looking back at me and them not being able to be seen. So them kind of like being able to maintain that that anonymity as a result of failures in photographic technology, or kind of like implicit like racism built into photographic technology. So I kind of started to think about like, okay, how is it that these spaces where maybe Black people have been written out of this like technology or have been kind of rendered invisible can actually be superpowers. And I mean, like I was reading Rolf Ellison's Invisible Man for the first time while I was making this work. So that also is like a huge part of it's, I can't really talk about this work without also like thinking about the things that I was thinking about and reading the things that we were reading while also reading that. Definitely, I think kind of like coalesced to produce the work that would come after it, which I think that's kind of the end of like the pre-Wayla section. Do you want me to kind of keep going into Wayla?
Well, I think, well, yeah, so we should, we're zooming through our time, so maybe we should move on to Wayla a bit and talk more about the essay itself, and hopefully that will bring us to some of the work that you've made kind of during the writing and after. But I did want to ask, and we've kind of covered this, but ask you directly, the way that you think about, well, I guess I just generally, I'm interested in the triangulation you talk about, where there's the viewer, the subject, and the image maker. And in your essay, you pretty clearly outline how, given the social and historical contexts of photography and the camera, how traditional image making positions the viewer at the top of that triangle in the position of power. And how, as we've just discussed with the image, the implicit bias test, you're working to kind of return some of the agency, or not necessarily agency, but some of the power, I guess, to the subject. I was interested in the way that you think about that triangle, or if, I guess, you think about that triangle at all in your non-representational work. So the sculptures, I guess, specifically is what I'm thinking of. I know we talked about it a little bit with your the hair portraits, but yeah, when you're working in other mediums, how do you conceptualize that relationship taking shape?
I think there's a similar, I can talk about the black flags, which I think, again, were made before I kind of had the language to understand that triangle between the subject, the viewer, and kind of the image maker and the camera, which like share a point on that triangle. But I think generally, like making sculpture even before this, there was always an aspect of like, I guess, control, or an element of like using photography and my work just in general to kind of like manifest a power that maybe I felt like I didn't necessarily have, or like a power specifically in like predominantly white spaces, there being so many that like I'm asked to exist inside of. And so sculpture for me did something that photography couldn't, which was like impose within space. And so photographs are traditionally like two-dimensional, presented on the wall. There's kind of one way to approach them, and it's kind of up to the viewer when they are kind of done looking at the work to step away from it, and that's kind of the only spot it exists in. And there was something about sculpture that that it could kind of exist outside of that space, or kind of like impose on the viewer, or kind of ask the viewer to do things that they maybe wouldn't otherwise, or even wouldn't want to. And that kind of allowing me as a maker to make the viewer aware of their body in the space. And then also within that, how is it that like different bodies relate to an object? So there's one of these works that exists on the floor. And when I show it, I always install it at the entrance to whatever space that it's in. And so like there's this distinct question that has to be navigated about whether or not you're gonna like walk on this object. And then also like, what does it mean to do that? And so I think there's kind of the element of like trying to step out of the triangle, like in that way, or kind of step above maybe the triangle. I think the triangle in relation to non-photographic work isn't something that I've like, I think the shape might change maybe, which would be really interesting. I don't know if it'd be a triangle anymore, because there might be other points that get added to it. But when making this work, there was like I think for that moment, there was the triangle, but then off of one of the points in the triangle came like a line, which was, that's where I became seated as kind of the maker and simultaneously the subject, which I often occupy both spaces in my work. But yeah, there was like the triangle, but then it kind of allowed the subject in this case, which being me, to take a step away from that triangle. So kind of still be connected to it, but not necessarily be in that direct relationship where there are two things kind of directly addressing you.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the you talking about the different ways that like the viewer will interact with a two-dimensional work on a wall versus a sculpture in space. But I can't help, and I know that with these flag works, you're viewing yourself kind of as the subject, as you know, as a large part, I guess, of the kind of amorphous subject. But to me, it seems like, you know, in the triangle, in the essay, you position the triangle as with the viewer on top, and then along the bottom line is the image maker and the subject. And you talk about wanting to orient that triangle in a way, that rotate it in a way that puts the subject on top. But I'm interested, it feels like a lot of these gestures put you as the maker on top, if that makes sense. Or maybe actively put the viewer on the bottom. And I guess this is kind of getting into a lot of like geometry we have to imagine, because we don't have these images with us.
Yeah, it feels like being a whiteboard.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, and like when you're making work, when you're not making work that you view yourself as being like the majority of the subject, I guess, non-representational work like these sculptures. And maybe this would be a good time to show one of the pieces, the new pieces you've made. But yeah, like do you take measures to ensure that it's still an upward facing triangle with the viewer as the subject rather as the position of power, or are you looking to kind of put yourself level with the subject, if that makes sense? So rather than rotating the triangle so it's still facing upwards with the subject as the point, rotating it so it's pointing downwards where the viewer is at the bottom of the totem.
Right. Yeah, I guess I've never thought about it that way, because when I'm making the work, it is so kind of impossible for me to like divorce myself totally from being simultaneously maker and subject. Kind of me making the work that I'm making, and like making work that is about blackness, but then also being only like able to make that through my lens. I think it's impossible for me to like remove myself from that position of subject, like entirely. So I think it's for me kind of like, I guess it's you saying that tells me whether or not like what's happening, because I think for me I'm in a position where like I'm simultaneously going to feel both the position of the subject and the maker, and that's like something I'll never necessarily be able to escape in my work. So maybe it is like a rotation of the triangle where in fact like the triangle is pointing downwards now. It's like the that I'm kind of interested in. So yeah, I'll say, but I'm gonna continue. There's like a work that I feel like, is this the one I want to use to try to answer that question? I'll come back to that. This is where I'll start.
And these are works that you, just for everyone who's unfamiliar, these are works from Nick's recent show that you had up as part of the residency you're participating in right now, right? Or
yes, correct.
Video program.
Yeah. So these were works that were originally planned for like my thesis in May, which obviously like could not be completed as planned. But so kind of to return to that question about the rotation of the triangle, I guess you might be right actually. It might be a rotation of the triangle where like myself as the maker and the viewer sit on an equal footing, and maybe like the next step for the work is to continue to rotate it maybe in that same direction. Again, we're like talking about grass, we're like moving, so kind of intangibly, but maybe the next part of the work is to kind of continue to rotate that triangle, so maybe it's not even pointing like in any particular direction, but it's actually like on an angle, whereas like you have one point which is the subject at the top, and then if you're just looking at it like top to bottom, kind of in terms of, I guess, y position, if we're graphing it, like you have the subject at the very top, me somewhere in between, and then the viewer at the bottom, you know what I mean? I don't think I need to be on the same like level with the viewer in making the work or in relation to the work, but I think for me it's all about, okay, like how is it that I can kind of return agency and return power to like those who are primarily looked at. The triangle is even more about just like visibility, and all of my like thinking about this is more about visibility, which is where this sculpture becomes relevant. So this is work that is like made kind of distinctly in line with or I guess post like the Wayla thinking, which we haven't even shown the website for. But yeah, maybe we'll circle back to that. But this is entitled 35% a lesson in spectral opacity learned from my neighbors. And so what this is, it's like the image kind of depicts, it's 5 tinted windows hanging in parallel. And basically I was thinking about a lot of like ways that kind of on the everyday Black people have already found to kind of like work against visibility. And something that I was seeing a lot of was tinted windows. And it kind of like hit me as like the brilliance in this really kind of simple gesture, which is like so regular now that it kind of on most like flies under most radars, we'll say, or kind of like isn't something that really sticks out. But it's like this really simple gesture that you can use to mediate your own like visibility. And thinking about who like this technology is primarily used by in the spaces that like I live in and primarily like exist in. So I think like this, what happens with this sculpture is maybe me trying to talk about the way these things work. And as I move forward in the work, something that's like important to me is learning how to talk to like certain audiences distinctly. So specifically talking like, how is it that I can make a work that kind of speaks to like just Black people? There's something like a person you and I know named Juan, who would talk about like kind of at Norfolk how he would speak like Spanish when he was around like white people when he distinctly like didn't want them to know what he was talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that's like something
They,
that
them.
what?
I think one uses they them pronouns.
Oh my God, thank you for correcting me. I wasn't aware. But that's something that they'll do like that was like something that really struck me as like a really brilliant gesture that they would do. And is like something that I'm really trying to bring into like my work moving forward. So kind of this aspect of like, how is it that the work can kind of talk about certain things to certain people while also not making that information available to other people, like which would kind of compromise talking about it at all.
Yeah, breaking up the viewer in a certain way, so exactly. Kind of destroying the triangle or expanding it. Okay, so I do have one more question, and I think after this we can get into the Q&A, and we've got some questions waiting. But unfortunately, this is another graph that we don't have an image of. But so we published through Bunker an abridged version of the essay, as we mentioned, and I think this ended up getting cut. But I wanted to bring this up because in talking about the essay with people after we published it, a lot of readers like brought up the counter argument, I guess, of historical instances in which images of Black people have actually been productive towards civil. So I'm thinking about, or people have mentioned, I guess, to me the infamous image of Emmett Till, or famous image of Emmett Till, and then just images used during the civil rights movement. And I wanted to give you, I guess, this platform to talk a little bit more. And I think you address this in the extended version of the essay and a little bit in the abridged version where you talk about Sontag. But I wanted to give you the platform to talk about your bell curve of tangibility. So first you can explain that, and then I have one more follow-up.
Yeah, so the bell curve of tangibility is like another graph that's kind of synthesized from some of like Susan Sontag's thoughts, which is that like there is the kind of the power of an image, and specifically I want to say she's talking about like images of suffering when being presented to a viewer, is that they're powerful at first because they make someone aware of like something horrible that's happening that they are not necessarily like in proximity to. But then as you like become inundated with seeing images like that, there's kind of another side of that where it becomes so regular that you become desensitized to it. And so therefore, like those images maybe start to lose that power to have an impact. And I think like this is a thought that becomes relevant in thinking about like images and documentation of like Black people being killed at the hands of the police, which like those images are important, don't get me wrong, but like thinking about them kind of how they exist in public space, and kind of outside of like court and judicial spaces like that. And to that point in the essay about, so that's like the bell curve of tangibility, but then also thinking about like, let's say positive like instances of Black image making, which like there have been a ton of. One thing I talk about in the extended version is like, for instance, like spaces that were designed distinctly to kind of like house positive Black representation and the effects that that had. So thinking about like Jet and Ebony magazine, and kind of what that allowed for, like what that allowed Black people to see, and the way that that allowed Black people to see themselves, and also like to carve out this space to say, in this way we can take control over our own representation. There's been like so many kind of other ways that that has happened. What I present with Wayla, and kind of the where I stand in relation to that, is recognizing that like while that is important, that feels to me like the only, I won't say only, but the distinct like primary way that Black people have kind of tried to address their representation, and the way that they've been made like invisible, and the ways that they've been made hypervisible, and the ways that their representation has been used against them, is to kind of like utilize this same tool in the same way that it was designed, to try to kind of go upstream. Whereas I think that is something that is like important. I'm trying to push to say there are other ways to use this tool, like, or can we even think about other ways to use this tool and to use this object to do that same thing? Can we kind of like broach this problem from other sides? Because I think, I mean, if we look at the history and we look at the moment we're in, and this is also something that I think we kind of cut for the abridged version, but like thinking about artificial intelligence is something that's really important to all of the thinking that like happens in my work and that led up to this essay. But thinking about the fact of like what the world of STEM looks like, in terms of like the breakdown of people that are in that space, and that it's like so kind of heavily like cisgendered hetero white males. And so you have all of these perspectives that aren't being represented. And this is like briefly touched on when I mentioned the black box phenomena in the abridged version. But you have all of these like perspectives that aren't being represented in the crafting of this technology that relies upon images that distinctly determines like life. You know, we have artificial intelligence that's involved in banking practices. We have artificial intelligence that's involved in housing practices. There was literal artificial intelligence that was denying people, like Black people, care in hospitals this summer, like in a pandemic. So it's like, this stuff is at our doorstep. And if this is the moment we're at, and this is the way we've been using the camera to try to address racism, essentially, and like address the position of being Black within like America and in the world as a whole, we're not winning, basically. Or like, it feels like, for me at least, the train is moving faster than we can use this tool in this way to stop it. And so I'm saying, I'm not like arguing against doing that, but I'm saying like, we have to approach this from other sides. And I can talk about this image as well, which is kind of like maybe as an answer to that question you asked earlier about how is it that I'm like starting to think about using photography, like straight photography, in relation to the image. This work is called Flash Blindness, and it's me like, in the most simple sense, I'm using a camera flash to like obscure my own identity from the camera I'm simultaneously photographing myself with. So thinking about like literally how can I use photographic technology against the camera's ability to render me. Yeah, so I'm not like against kind of Black people making images, but I think there's also, I wrote this essay because I felt like there was all of these things that maybe weren't also being considered in picking up a camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, with that, I think we should move on to the Q&A. Although I do want to say, I feel like we could go for a while. Just with all of that, you've got me thinking about I mean, and all of you will have to, if you have not already, read the essay, because Nick goes into a pretty interesting history, a summary of photography's history, and talks about the way that photography and cameras and image making technology has kind of gone from a passive tool in all of these racialized systems of oppression through, and I think the AI, I say this because I think AI is one of the great examples you use, to being kind of an actor, being infused with the biases of its creators and then turning into an active perpetuator of these systems. So that, as you just said, but I think there's a really great, you discuss that really beautifully in the essay. So I'd encourage everyone to return to it. All right, so with that, let me pull up the Q&A section. And we can pick out some good questions. So we've got a lot of questions about the triangle, I think, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, same.
So Christine Cortez says, as we attempt to, quote, step, quote, out of the triangle, or, quote, above it, as you say, or make the shape change, I found it ironic that within the conversation, the white line makes up the triangle in a black space or background, loosely referring to the white gaze belonging in every section of the figurative representation. If in certain contexts, such as violence and visibility, decolonization is not possible, do you think there are ways we can post-colonize the lens? So I guess this is a little bit about, yeah, I guess kind of what you hint at the end of your essay, and I didn't say this before, but the essay is interesting in that it functions kind of as an artist statement and kind of as an argumentative essay, I guess. So yeah, so echoing what Christina said, yeah, do you think there's a way that image makers can work beyond all of this complex history? Because even with these images you're producing, they still exist within this, not only the history of image making that you discuss as being so implicated in the history of race and racism, but also they're emerging into a world in which everyone, like you say, is coded in this white gaze. So is there, I guess, to paraphrase what Christina said, do you think there's any way to really make an image that's completely post-colonial?
Ooh, what a question. I think there's a way to make an image. I think it has to do with how we think about image. I think that question is like a question that I'm incredibly interested in, and it's kind of like a question that I'm really fumbling to try to answer in my own practice, and kind of like invite anyone else to take on in their practice. And I would love to kind of know what you kind of learn from it, because that's also like, I'm just looking to have a conversation, and I'm actually like curating a project right now called House Fire through Cumulus Photo that like centers around this, but I think it has to do with thinking about how we define an image, and I think that is something that is relevant to that discussion about artificial intelligence and like the kind of subset of that and like machine learning. I think we have to start redefining image, because I mean, like, this is something Hito Sterl talks about, but we exist in a moment where we have, like, in the context of machine learning, we have computers that are teaching other computers how to see. And so in that, we have images that are being made by computers to be seen by other computers. And these are images that never cross the eye of a human being, which like has never happened before in history. And so what does that mean? Like, if that image never appears on a display or isn't something that ever crosses the like human eye, I think we have to start redefining what we think about as an image. And that for me is relevant in this sculpture, because it was like something I was thinking about while I was making it, but it wasn't like a distinct, it was in the back of my mind. And I think now that the sculpture like is kind of living and I've had the opportunity to exist with it, but this sculpture is a photograph in a lot of ways. And I like am sitting more and more with the fact that this sculpture, when you break down the word photograph etymologically, kind of coming having to do with like photons and light, and then graphs being drawings, when you're in this space with this sculpture, and like I was lucky enough to be able to install it in front of a window, as you walk around it, this kind of multiplying effect happens, which you can kind of see with the windows, where as they stack, they get darker, and you get this kind of thing that doesn't happen. So it's like illuminating or kind of illustrating this property of visibility through light, um, like demonstratively, but it's not fixed. So like, is this sculpture a photograph? I kind of think so. And if so, then like, if I made a sculpture that's a photograph, what does that say about how we move forward utilizing photograph and like image? So do I think there are any ways we can like make images that are post-colonial? I would have to think so, but I think it involves reconsidering what it means when we say image.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good transition into a question that Elizabeth Kinnane Smith, my sister, has posted in the chat, but I think it's relevant. So she writes, having come to the conclusion that the medium of photography inherently centers the white gaze, what media do you feel are less steeped in histories of racial violence, while remembering, as you pointed out, that to some extent the white gaze has been internalized in the viewer and the image maker? So I guess you've discussed this a little bit just now with this work, but I guess to push you on that, do you think that there's more, I guess, post-colonial potential in mediums that are divorced from the camera itself?
Well, I think that starts to, okay, that does, like, that question is a really important question, because it pushes beyond the camera and kind of points at the system of like racism that is imbued into so many things, in kind of like really invisible ways. So I approached like this thinking saying, I'm someone who knows about cameras. I've spent my time studying cameras. I've spent my time studying photography. I can talk about this thing that is behind photography through photography. But I think that's just as relevant in like conversations that I'll hear from like graphic designers that I'm friends with, who talk about the same biases like in graphic design, and kind of the heralding of like Swiss design and kind of designs that come out of these like white academic spaces. And then I like the first thing, like the first place my brain went to that question was like, okay, is like literature a place of that? But then I think about like, okay, well, what are the standards that we kind of hold in literature, and where do those standards come from? And like, is even the presentation of the way we navigate literature, and this is like a really, like, these are literally just thoughts that are coming to me right now, but like, is there something even in the presentation of literature as we understand it that is rooted kind of like in white hegemony and in colonialism? And I think like those are questions, like I would love to see someone who's in the position that I'm in relation to photography, who's in that position in relation to like writing, try to answer that question, because they'll probably like come to things that I wouldn't. So that's a really important question, because like I think through that question we can kind of start to inch up the chain. It's like a spider web, it's a network. We can start to work our way back up the network to kind of the kind of source, the original sin that has like branched out into all of these other things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another one that I like. It's my biology background is
I can't see them on my end, so I'm just gonna, just so you know.
Oh yeah, maybe end the screen share. So
I can put a couple in the Q&A. I see 3 in the Q&A, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going for this first one that I'm I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but Anna Mirzayan asks, wondering if you could talk a bit about how this kind of information or data from DNA relates to a term that you use, Nick, or a phrase that you use, race as a technology. Or maybe just, yeah, taking that and running with it. How you consider race to be a technology.
Okay, so I mean, I think on the most basic sense, like race is something that was constructed in order to make certain people other, in an effort to, at least in like colonial contexts, subjugate them. So literally, like, race exists. Race was kind of born out of a space of needing a justification to deem like it okay to subjugate other people. And so race is like simply a system for taking people and categorizing them, which is like a kind of technology. And so the relation between like DNA and that, and I don't think I know enough about like specifically the biological makeup of DNA in its relationship to race to talk about it from that kind of point of view. But what I can say about the relationship of like DNA to race as a technology would be, see, I started to like go down a train of thought, but even then, I kind of caught myself. So I'm gonna have, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that with saying, with like talking on the way that race kind of is a technology. But I can say, I mean, what's to say that, no, I'm gonna stop there before I'm like opening too many doors in my head right now.
Yeah.
That like I want to go down, but like I can't get all of us lost in there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I would just say that I don't know. I think that is a really interesting question, and honestly, I think that there's the relationship is kind of circumstantial in that it's, you know, like race is this entirely made up thing, and the only connection is that it's like it's this attribute that we've made up that is connected to DNA, and that they are both like based on one's ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, you know, there's no direct correlation, I would say. But I do think that's interesting, like thinking about the terms technology and how the way that you're thinking about like information, I guess, in this work, like what you can read as being potentially legible, and then withholding the access to that analyzation, I guess, or that analysis. Yeah, so there's a kind of different kind of mediation of information here.
Yes.
All right, so we've got a follow-up. I'll read this quickly. So to contextualize, Anna says, to contextualize my question a little, I had in mind the way these words of DNA and ancestry data have opened up the ability for so many people to claim to be non-white or no longer white based on some distant percent of ancestry. Yeah, so I mean, I'll let you respond to this, but I would just say that I think, I mean, like we said, that I think it is kind of just a correlative. It's not really causal. And yeah, I mean, I think that kind of just starts to pull apart like how BS the idea of race is in the first place. You know, for someone that's lived their life as white to take an ancestry test and say, I'm 16% like black. So
Right, which is like to say, I mean, I think that kind of opens up like a maybe a bit of friction between like the biological like understandings of race and also the kind of sociological like understanding of race, and like what it means to kind of exist in a certain body every day. I mean, like there are white people that come from like heritages that aren't necessarily like distinctly European or like all the way kind of, they're like are people who exist in the world as white people who are kind of in their quotidian like day-to-day existence spaces as white people, whether they know it or not, um, who don't necessarily like come from European heritage directly, or like that's not where their lineage traces to. And so I think it even kind of like, you know, it's like when people are like race isn't real, but simultaneously it is so real, because it is like totally made up, but it does have like very tangible impacts for people in their everyday like in their everyday lives. So I mean, I think, yeah, there's even that fact of like when we consider race in relation to DNA, I wasn't thinking about DNA and making like these images as like this is distinctly Black DNA, but thinking about like these are Black people, and that is the people for like me who is important that I extend this thinking for, or like if there's anything I kind of develop in my work that becomes valuable as a means to like escape visibility and racism, who is it that it feels like pertinent for me to address it with and kind of through as like other Black people.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's great. And I do like the biological versus sociological distinction. I think that's an important way to think about it, or at least that's how I think about it. All right, so maybe we can do one more quick one and then call it a day. We've got one more question that says, curious about what representational means in this context. And I think this is from when we were discussing, or I had some questions about the representational versus non-representational. I guess I should have said figurative maybe, but I'll finish reading the question. So, curious about what representational means in this context and how the term functions. Is there a distinction between figural representation or other kinds? Or does representation exclusively refer to images of people? Thanks again. So that's kind of an art question, but I think it's actually pretty relevant to the different ways you're working, because like these are images that are, the hair is acting as a stand-in for the body, but it's not. And I think thinking about the different ways you're getting at sort of representation, because I would argue that all of your work is pointing towards a body, like a subject,
Yeah,
a Black subject usually.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that how direct that representation is of a figure, I'm interested in hearing how you think how the way that how direct that representation is affects the read and the orientation of your image maker and subject in that triangle we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. I think in every like, in every work, I'm trying to do essentially the same thing, but it's like I'm trying a different means to do it. And so I think I'm in a space now where I'm like trying to get away from figural representation. So kind of like with this question explicitly, representation does not just refer to like exclusively images of people. I mean that in like the kind of most basic something that is a stand-in for something else. But yeah, I talk on like figural representation most specifically. That in relation to kind of like the triangle and how power is kind of allocated through representation. I'm sitting in a space right now with my practice, and like this may change as I kind of move through the work and grow. And I think that's like the reason why I'm doing this is like I kind of my practice for me is just a means to like constantly challenge my ideas and like actually try to get to an answer. So I think I'm going to go down like a lot of roads that maybe won't be it. So right now I'm in a space where like I'm really trying to get away from a utilization of the figure. And this is like still really remnants of reading Invisible Man, and kind of like I won't spoil that book if you haven't read it, but it's like a book that has become like incredibly important to me and in my practice, and thinking about like kind of being at a place where like there is so much that kind of comes at the experience of being seen, where I'm kind of like, okay, is there a way to, and this is like the very question I end the essay on. I think it's like the last sentence is like, is there space in the blind spots of the white gaze for people who are non-white to like begin to self-determine and begin to like make identities for themselves that exist beyond the context of race. And that's not to say that like race is everyone for anyone, but to say like, is it possible to kind of begin to even like disappear selectively, of course, and that's what I mean when I say like selective invisibility, but like, are there spaces we can start to make that can't necessarily be seen by white people, or like can't be affected by, or yeah, I'm asking the question of like, are there spaces we can start to create that are outside of the realm of colonialism, or like outside of the effects of colonialism, and how do we make those spaces, and then what can happen in those spaces? But I'm like just starting to kind of even try to figure out like how is it that we can start to kind of even pull back or like get away from it. I think there's a counterpoint to me somewhere. Like there's probably someone somewhere who's making like who's approaching a similar question, trying to go the opposite direction. And I think like both perspectives are important.
Mhm.
I think I've just chosen to occupy the one that I am because it felt like for me, I wasn't seeing enough of like people in this perspective.
I think that's a great point to end on. That quest that seems to be riddled with failure, and to complete the circle, as you started with your first image, is the image you knew would be a failure, but you set out to make anyway. So the practice of learning through failure with all the important questions that you set out to answer.
Right, but also I don't want to say that image was a failure. I knew
No, not at all. But
the creation, wouldn't work. But in that, I mean, it's exactly like finding new space in doing things that you know won't work, maybe as planned.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for coming today, and thank you, everyone, all the attendees. Great questions today. I think there's a lot that I'll be left thinking about, and I hope you all feel the same way. Again, if you haven't read the essay, I would definitely recommend checking it out on I think the link is in the chat, but also on Bunker Projects. And we didn't even talk about it, but Nick has an incredible way of presenting the essay on his website, nickdrain.com. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So check that out as well. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody who came. I'm like just now seeing the chat, and I'm seeing a lot of familiar names, which is amazing. But thank you to all of those familiar, those I know and those I do not. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. All right. Feel free. Yep.